Okay, thank you, Ron. Thank you for inviting me. Those of you who know me, I felt I needed to be smarter, so I needed some new glasses. So I feel a lot smarter now. However, when I look here, I realize that if this is a mind map of my view of participative ergonomics, then maybe I'm not so smart after all. But we tried to have a look at, this is a number of years ago, what are the different descriptions of participative ergonomics that appear, because it's sometimes a little bit of a, it's not clear. I think people throw the word around, but people have many different ideas about it, depending who you talk to and which part of the world you come from. And so, long ago, I was involved in some intervention studies where we were trying to implement participative ergonomics. I'll actually back up from there and say before that, we were actually trying to find companies who were interested in change around ergonomics. And we did find some. We waited and found some. Our funder wasn't that happy because we spent a lot of time waiting. But every company we went into, after initial work there, they went out of business. So I'm not claiming credit for that, but it's a very expensive and frustrating way of doing research to find companies who are about to change and then work with them. So back in the early 90s then, what was the best way to implement interventions to prevent musculoskeletal disorders? And the literature certainly seemed to advocate participative ergonomics. And so we put in place a set of interventions in a kind of quasi-experimental design to see what we could find out. And last year I talked to you just a little bit about those. And this year I wanted to follow up with some thinking we've done and a bit of investigation about how could PE be regarded as fitting in or not to other management system elements, especially occupational health and safety management issues. And so now that you've all absorbed this, I'll actually get on with the presentation. So as Ron kindly said, we're going to have a look at how do participative ergonomics descriptions match up with how other occupational health and safety risks and hazards are handled. And so I really need to credit my colleague. I mean, here's Danny, who is a PhD student in the Work and Health program. And he has been a health and safety manager and ISO auditor. And so he's been a great help in terms of clarifying to me what the heck management systems are and how they might work on the ground. And so if there's anything that is unclear in here, don't blame him, blame me. So, as I mentioned, last year's talk had a reflection on some multiple case studies. And what we found is that there were challenges with implementation and sustainability. And so, coming back to my original question, is why would a prevention of an occupational health and safety issue be handled with a standalone ergonomics program rather than folding it into the hundreds and hundreds of other risks and hazards that an organization must handle, must identify, or anticipate, identify, assess, and control. And so we had that question. And there may be very good answers why participative ergonomics programs need to be set up separately. Why that is so. I have an open mind right now, but the question was, why might that be? So the purpose, as I indicated, is let's take a accepted standard health and safety management system, OHSAS 18001, and this was before the CSA Z1000 came out, and so we use this. And let's have a look at what elements are present, and then see whether those elements are present in participative ergonomics. So just a very slight digression here. Occupational health and safety management systems, Deming, Plan, Do, Check, Act. And if we look over here on your right, we've got a cycle here. And so there's nothing very special about this, but these are the elements that we tend to see, both in this and many other occupational health and safety management system literature. And the point that's often made is there are a number of these systems that are present in companies. Now, the companies may or may not have had these registered and be certified as a ISO XYZ, but we can use this perhaps as an indication of some of the things that go on, especially in larger companies. And so the point of this slide is not to have you remember it particularly in detail, but I think the issue is whether we're dealing with a health safety management system, we're dealing with a quality management system, or an environmental management system. The point is they look the same. They have the same kinds of elements. And so that was the kind of thinking is, if these different programs for controlling quality, environment, and occupational health and safety are built to have the same elements, why does participative ergonomics not have those? So that's a little bit of a sneak preview. But that was the question. We see this nice parallelism, but participative ergonomics seems to be different. So as an example, I just want to take two examples. And just for the sake of argument, we'll take the MSD prevention guideline that was a product of a project with the Occupational Health and Safety Council of Ontario, and that's about 7 years ago. And that was set up on a participative philosophy, let's put it like that. If we go down to Z1000 or Z1004, we see these kinds of diagrams, which is again the plan, do, check, act approach. And so if we look at them, they don't look the same. Now, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Does it matter? And so as ergonomists and people looking at musculoskeletal disorder prevention, this might be more familiar. But to many other people within an organization, that may be more familiar to them. Very briefly, because the project is based around Occupational Health and Safety Assessment System series, I beg your pardon, just some thoughts about what it is. So it's developed in response to widespread demand for a recognized standard of gains wish to be certified and assessed. And this is in particular for health and safety management systems. So there's nothing special about it. There's lots of variants on it, but this is the one we chose. So out of all of the pieces within that standard and looking at the CSA and other occupational health and safety management system standards, we identified 22 elements, and that involved collapsing some and trying to make sense of them. And so these are the 22 elements that seem to be present in the occupational health and safety management literature. So, using this as a base, a research question then would, how many of these elements appear in descriptions of participative ergonomics? And from that we can ask a couple of questions. What are the similarities and differences? And the real purpose then is to say which elements of the management system may be used perhaps to improve our implementation and sustainability of MSD prevention activities. Or can we enhance occupational health and safety management systems with what we've learned with participative ergonomics? Or both. Question?
Can I just clarify which 18001 version you're using? Because you said it preceded Z1000. So would you be using the 1999 version or the one that came out like 2006?
I think it's the 2006. I would have to check on that. Okay, so we've got some description now of an occupational health and safety management system. But what is participative ergonomics? And if you look through the literature, there's 101 different definitions. And so we needed to at least have something that we could compare against. And so, fortunately, we had a very nice review, Dwayne, that gave us a good sampling of the then papers around participative ergonomics. And so we said, let's pick those that seem to be most influential. And by putting all of those together, we should be pretty sure that we've got a description of what participative ergonomics is. So that was our thinking. And so did a citation analysis, and we picked papers with 10 or more citations since they were published, and at least one per year since they were published. So we figured that was at least a kind of minimum criteria that at least one person figured it was worth citing. And if you've ever done citation analyses, many papers get 0 citations, except the author, which tend to be discounted. We chose 20 papers, and I've got the 20 papers we chose, which we can look at the end, but I'm not going to go into that for now. Suffice it to say that there's people in the room have papers in that list, so I don't think anybody's going to say, why isn't my paper in that list? Now here comes the judgment piece, and the judgment is this element present in this paper? And we're talking about a little more than a mention. So is there a relevant description of that element within these papers? Now some papers, that wasn't their purpose, particularly to survey the whole piece. But remember, what we're trying to do is to come up with a big picture of what participative ergonomics is. And so what we found is that there were very strong concentrations in some elements and almost complete absence of others. And so if this is a program within a company that's supposed to have policies and be sustaining and long-lived, either we've got to take those blank pieces and supplement our participative ergonomics, or make sure participative ergonomics is inserted into them. So those with a green have, I think there's 9 pieces where there is good description. And we can quibble about good or not good, but in general, these were the 9 that were described. So, kind of scope. Often, participative ergonomics seem to be not organization-wide. Tended to be more localized. Just about all of them addressed hazard identification, risk assessment, and determination of control. A lot of stuff there. A lot of them didn't have details on objectives and descriptions of the program. And again, remember though that these are papers well cited in this area, and not every single one of them was a step-by-step description of how you would implement the whole program. So this is an overview of what topics were mentioned within these papers. So here, number 4, most of the papers described resources, roles, responsibilities. And training and competence were mentioned by many of them. Surprisingly, many of them didn't go into much detail about participation, which is kind of interesting. They probably mentioned it, but they didn't go into detail to describe exactly what they meant by participation. And participation can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. Performance monitoring, yes. So the application, control of documents were typically not provided, and a small amount of information about communication management review and documentation. So these last few tend to be not covered very well. So coming back to our picture, we can see that the participative ergonomics papers in the literature that are well cited spend a lot of time talking about some things and very little or nothing about some other things. So the question is, what might that mean? So this is neither good nor bad, this is just what's there. Okay, remember what we're trying to do is make sure that our MSD prevention activities, some of which involve what's called ergonomics, are implementable and sustainable. Because if they're not implemented, they can't be sustained. If they can't be sustained, you might as well have not have implemented them. So you need both, if we're going to affect a large number of people at a time. So, let's go back to our pictures here. And again, what I emphasized is that they look completely different. The language is completely different. So what you might want to do is to kind of look across and figure out where are the common elements and where the elements might be missing. So this is actually the OHSAS MSD prevention strategy, which, not being in the scientific literature or even grey literature, was not part of those 20 papers. So what do you see that's present in CSAZ 1004? Linda?
So it seemed like the elements of the left-hand side can be found in the do and check domains, and in particular the identification of hazards can be found under the implementation and controls are probably in there too. And then under the evaluation, and follow up on and evaluate success of implemented controls. In the left-hand side would map into evaluation.
Yeah, so tends to be down here. Yeah, and there's not everyone in there, but that seems to be the general mapping. But I think you get a different idea about what you're going to do if you look at these two different diagrams. Well, I think you do anyway. I'm quite happy to be corrected on that. They look different, you've got different words, and I think you'd approach it differently if you were given the thing on the right-hand side versus the thing on the left-hand side.
On the left side, you have how to manage a program. On the right side, you have how to manage a system.
I think that's a good idea. I'm not sure that this is managing a program, but I think your general idea, I think that seems like a good way to think of it. Any other thoughts?
On the left-hand side, what was establish a foundation for success about?
That's talking in very general terms about some of these things over here. So a foundation for success would in fact be some of the management elements, but very briefly. And set up using different words than would typically be used over on the right side.
And it seems, Richard, on the left, the end is communicate results, and on the right, it's management review. And in a way, it seems like it's identifying where the power is. On the right-hand side, it's with management. On the left-hand side, we're trying to convince people that maybe we did some good stuff, rather than being able to make a decision to actually carry on doing it.
I think that's an interesting observation. The Z1004 title is Workplace Ergonomics, a Management and Implementation Standard. So it is specifically a management standard concerned with implementation. And so I think your comments are right on there. So buried within these two diagrams is quite different views of the world, I think. Any other comments? What, Dwayne?
So is it not true, though, that the plan, do, check, act loop is within the diagram on the left, although not explicitly stated a number of times? So even potentially from the beginning blocks with establishing foundation, but certainly it appears in the do MSD has exist, and then that loop appears to me to be implicit in that a number of times.
I don't deny that it's implicit.
Right, okay.
Yeah.
It's not explicitly stated.
And it's not set up in this way either. So I think, although there are many elements that are common, they're set up in a very different looking diagram. And they use different words. So again, remember that the mapping we had between OHSAS 18001 and the PE papers was not about this particular implementation. And because this is then a more on-the-ground kind of implementation, it probably has more details than a paper in the journal literature would have. And so the picture may not be quite as dire as looking at the scientific literature as we might fear. But still, if we had access to a whole bunch of more ground-level documents, NIOSH documents, if we went into some companies and looked what their participative ergonomics programs or projects look like, we may see a better match of elements. But still, it's set up differently and uses different words. Now, this was my introduction to participative ergonomics. And this came out of the quasi-experimental design we did back in the early 90s. And so this was a kind of our ergonomics change program. And I was pretty naive then when I created this in 2 days. So this is not definitely, I didn't have any references for most of this, which is perhaps not the best academic approach, but we desperately needed an application manual for our people who are implementing our programs. And so what came about then, after discussion with people, was that we have a problem-solving loop in the middle, and then we have the support for it around. Again, using different words though. So what I did is then I took the MSD strategy from this book, and using our match process against PE, just had a look about which ones seem to be strong within this. And again, there's a degree here, and put around it some of those things that didn't seem to be addressed very well. And so in general, I still think then of this as more of a implementation on the ground approach. And this is the kind of support to make sure it stays around. So that's putting together a number of pieces here. Our review of the literature, looking at our current Ontario, I guess I'll call it standard, because this is recommended to many companies by the health and safety system. And so let's just take this just a little further. Some of the things that I think are worth thinking about, because in general these participative ergonomics, they're called programs, but they look more like projects because they're not linked in a sustainable way. In fact, you might think about the similarities between something like a Lean or Six Sigma and a participative ergonomics project. And if you think of it that way, there are perhaps more similarities to those project-based activities than the program. Now, number two, I don't think is a very insightful comment because we're looking at the peer-reviewed literature. But many practitioners read that literature hoping to get some ideas about how to implement their own participative ergonomics program in their own company. Implementation, always a challenge, and not a lot of information on how to do that. So, number 4 and 5, I think are some of the key findings and recommendations, is that there's many elements in the management system description. And I think even though companies or organizations may not have a formal certification, the words that are used in the activities are different within PE. So the silence about some of these activities, management activities, may impact the effectiveness and sustainability of our PE initiatives. We're simply not doing some of the things we might need to do. If we remember back to our diagram here, perhaps we're a little too focused here and not enough focused here. Again, this is a proposition which I'm very interested to discuss. And so the way I'm thinking about it is that if we pay a little bit more attention to management approaches and language, we could make our MSD prevention activities more effective and sustainable, or at least implementable and sustainable. At least we'll be in the game, perhaps, rather than be out by ourselves using different language and different approaches. Okay, let me just take a quick sideline and then I'll join us back up again. So we did a series of interviews with ergonomists across Canada, and we asked them about what they did, and many of them were involved in thinking about MSDs as a health and safety issue. They did a lot of workplace assessments. And what we found is that they used very simple observational tools in general in their practice. And the comment was, if I've got 10 hours to look at this problem, am I going to spend 9 of them analyzing the video frame by frame? And they only used more complex or in-depth risk assessment approaches, NIOSH, Snook tables, for example, when they needed to convince somebody that there was a problem or that they were digging down because they weren't sure what was going on. And Patrick Newman can correct me or add to this later on in the discussion if we need to. So I thought that was interesting, and that's an interesting story in and of itself, which is there's A and B here. But the third piece, bullet point 3, was something that my colleague Nancy Thaberge was looking at, and the consultants, or even in-house ergonomists, spent a lot of time doing what was termed organizational work. So just hold that idea. And organizational work meant hooking up with managers, trying to talk to the quality department, or whomever to get going and doing what they were actually most experienced in, which is design, assessment, controls. So looking forward then, I think we need to pay attention to management approaches, processes, procedures, and language. It may mean we do the same things, but we might want to use different language and organize our diagrams differently. Now, number 2, I think, is arguable, and some of you may remember MSD had a small conference workshop on this. So, should the health and safety system in Ontario adopt Z1000, Z1004 as the guiding light for its OHS health and safety? All health and safety associations use Z1000 as a basis for all of their training, for example. Then everybody's talking from the same sheet, singing from the same songbook. So that may help. Because they seem to be doing so much organizational work, if we could free ergonomists from that, they could do a better job and spend more time, thus do a better job on hazard ID design and controls. And the way I see it, a lot of the organizational work is actually management system stuff. Now, I've heard it said is that, in fact, adopting something like Z1004, some ergonomists I've talked to said, oh, we have difficulty enough getting into a company without having to implement a health and safety system, management system. My thought was that ergonomists don't have to, or shouldn't have to, create a management system. If that is the dominant paradigm across our health and safety system, then that system will be there for them to plug into. Therefore, perhaps reducing the organizational work. These are hypotheses. And if we do go a standards way, we've got lots of rich resources from the participative ergonomics approach. So these are some ideas. And so we're trying to see whether these work, how they work, and we're engaged in a 3-year study with my colleague Amin Yazdani, where we're doing interviews with a very wide range of key informants, people from business, from labor, consultants, business consultants, health safety consultants, to see how they see this issue of prevention of MSD and how it might fit within a management system. We're also doing a series of case studies in companies where Amin actually goes into a company and does a whole series of interviews with everybody from CEOs down to workers to see how they see MSD prevention working or not working. And that would include document analyses and other issues. And some of the kind of questions that we're asking, these are a sampling, would be the first one, which is a question about how practical might it be to put MSD prevention as just another risk. And I say that advisedly, we can come back to that. So what are the barriers and challenges? And this third point, which I think is an interesting one, which is MSD prevention different from any other prevention activity for noise, for dust, for violence, for psychological health? So we've just had a standard on psychological health, which I always forget the number, Z1003. And when we look at Z103, we see a lot of what they call psychological issues, which actually look quite like psychosocial issues that we talk about in MSDs. And so, why do we believe that MSDs are special and different? They're special and different because they affect a large number of people and the suffering and costs that involves. But why do we choose to address them and prevent them in a different way? So that's what we're asking people. I don't have an answer to this. I hope maybe to come back next year and tell you what we found. And so the last point there is, now you have a mandate for psychological hazards in the workplace. In general, my experience has been that management, in terms of prevention MSD, is comfortable with, let's call them physical risk factors. But they run a mile if you talk about psychosocial factors. So it's interesting that we now have a standard and some activity where people are addressing what I would call psychological and psychosocial factors. So perhaps that'll take the stigma out of psychosocial issues around MSD prevention. So acknowledgements here. We have a number of colleagues on our team, industrial engineers, Patrick Newman, We have Mark Pagel, who's from business school. He used to be at York, and I always have difficulty not having a smile when I read that one. I guess Mr. Smurfett is who is talking about, and my colleague Nancy DeBerge. Amin is standing as our coordinator, and this is funded by grants provided by the WSIB before it changed. And so that's where I'd want to end. If you want to follow the project, we're not tweeting about it, but you could go to this link on the TreMSD website to see where we're at. And I hope to come and tell you the answers, or at least some thoughts, about some of these issues, perhaps next year when we've done many of these interviews and have got a sense about how different players within the occupational health and safety, within business, view prevention of MSD and how we might make it better. Thank you.